All right. So, first and foremost, welcome everyone. As I have said before, this week is special topics. And I say special topics because we're looking at, in particular, niche sections of juvenile justice that we don't really, well, we can, but we don't uh, cover this type of content in a whole week. There'd be way too much. So these are just some particular components of juvenile justice that we want to cover uh, that kind of give a broader understanding. So this is what special topics is. So that being said, so let's talk about juveniles and the drug trade. So I do want to emphasize something real quickly. Um, One of the things that we're talking about in particular today is different types of crime that juveniles can be engaged in. We've kind of said it before, but juveniles can be engaging in any type of crime. So it's not that juveniles only participate in one type of crime; they participate in all types of crime. So what we are talking about a little bit is right now we're going to focus exclusively on the drug trade, which is production and selling of drugs, whether they're illegal drugs or they're prescription drugs that they're simply selling to other people. That's what we're talking about. And so, very simply, there's just a couple things I want to talk about. And first, and I have it here, let's be honest, no one is safe from this influence. I do want to emphasize this very particularly because we do tend to focus on juvenile delinquency being something closely related to being poor. One thing that we talk about a lot is poverty is a large indicator and motivator for pretty much criminal behavior across the board. But it is important to note that it is not just juveniles who come from poor backgrounds that get engaged in the drug trade. It happens to everyone. It is not exclusive to just poor kids, and it's not exclusively one race of kids or the other. It's everyone. Everyone has the potential to be involved in the illegal drug trade. And so, realistically, and that's why I wanted to start with that, is because the factors that tend to influence people towards the drug trade, specifically juveniles, is things like economic disadvantage, aka poverty. You know, if you grow up in an area where there's not a lot of money, there's hardships that the family deals with, things like that. Yeah, for sure, it's a quick and easy way to make money. So economic disadvantage is one of the big factors that influence individuals towards drug trade. Again, that's also not just at the kid level, that's at any level. Um, at the child level, specifically at the juvenile level, we see that a lack of positive role models tends to be a factor that can influence towards the drug trade. If there's not a good role model that says, not to get involved with it, not just don't do drugs, but like actually talking about the seriousness of it, that can lead to this. There are societal pressures to get engaged with it, or necessarily, you need to have this certain amount of money or clothing or some kind of clout that makes you on equal footing, so that might lead a juvenile towards the drug trade, as well as, honestly, family coercion. And this is why I want to emphasize it's not just the poor or a racially distinct group that's exclusive to the juvenile drug trade. Because we know in some cases, if there are family members who are actively involved in the illegal drug trade, there is a likely chance that there's an influence of that on the juvenile themselves as well. They could be involved with it just as much as the parent. That might even be the gateway into them getting into that. So it's a whole complicated matter. I want to mention that family coercion, it's not straightforward. It's not one of the big ones, but it is something to note. But yes, the big ones tend to be the economic disadvantage and the social or societal pressures. So why get involved? And yeah, it's slightly different question than what are the factors that lead to it, because there is a slight difference, and that's, Economic vulnerability and the lure of quick cash is the big one. Like, I can't deny it. I already said it in a slightly different way, but this is the reality. The illegal drug trade is a quick cash venture. You sell product, you get money. It's that quick. It's not like a bank heist where you have to figure out all these things. It's not like a robbery where you plan and have to follow someone. It's not a extortion or anything like that. No, it's you get product, you sell product, you get cash. End of there. That's the reality. The illegal drug trade is quick cash. Now, that being said, I did mention societal influences for pressure, and that's where we get into things like gang affiliation and peer pressure. Especially when we consider juveniles, and we consider juveniles who have regular involvement with known gang individuals, members, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, I want to emphasize, because this is something that I don't think most everyday people understand. It's kind of a misunderstanding of things, but not every gang is involved in the illegal drug trade. And when we look at, in particular, juvenile gangs or gangs that have a high number of juvenile membership, there is a higher rate of drugs because it tends to be an easy thing that youth can get involved in. It's complicated and weird, and there's other discussions in other classes about organized crime and how different gangs participate in different types of crime. So I want to just, state that first. So not every gang does get involved with drugs, but we do know that those gangs that do have drug connections, yeah, that's going to play an influence, especially if a juvenile gets involved with that gang. And as well, general peer pressure is a real thing. Whether you personally did not fall to peer pressure or not, peer pressure is a legitimate problem in, our culture and society as a whole. Individuals can be influenced by the desire and need to belong. And so if a peer group that they want to be involved with is telling them they need to engage in something, an individual is more likely to be involved in it. And so, yeah, we have that problem of peer pressure that leads individuals to get involved in that illegal drug trade. So, believe it or not, exposure to drug use and violence within a quote-unquote safe environment, so like the home environment, neighborhood, things like that, that kind of increased exposure does actually have some long-term effects and motivations to get involved. It's a weird thing. I want to emphasize that. I'm trying to think how I want to phrase exactly what I want to say here. So, being exposed to violence, to drugs, things like that, does over time desensitize individuals to it. That's not a controversial statement. That's a factual statement that we understand, is that over time, overexposure to something can lead to it being less serious or less concerning to an individual. Same thing with drug use and drugs. If illegal drugs are being used constantly in the environment that a child is exposed to, yeah, they very well might get involved in the illegal drug trade because it's desensitized to them. It's not a serious issue. It's just something that happens. So it's complicated, but it's important to note that this is something that can lead to that. Obviously, I already said a lack of positive role models, but there's also the issue of a lack of positive opportunities. So this one we don't tend to talk about very much, but if you have a group of individuals who are living in an area where there is not a positive way to get out of poverty or a positive way to get out of a negative situation, yeah, these things tend to become more positive seeming, more like the way out. And I want to emphasize that's part of that illusion with the lure of quick cash for the drug trade in particular, is if you need money to get out of a bad situation and there's not a whole lot of positive opportunities in your neighborhood, selling drugs is a quick way to make money, and it's a quick way to make enough money to get out. And so, completely serious, sometimes these issues compound on each other. They add to each other, and so it leads to, again, getting involved. And then if you remember when we talked about risk factors and protective factors, yeah, any number of those personal risk factors of a juvenile getting involved in juvenile delinquency apply here for the drug trade. If there is problems at home, if there is a history of abuse problems, things like that, yeah, they're likely to get involved in this. It's just the unfortunate reality of how this works. And please note, I'm not saying that every juvenile who grows up in a neighborhood with lots of drugs is going to get involved in the drug trade. What I am saying is, if they grow up in that environment, they are more likely to get involved with the illegal drug trade. So, as far as the illegal drug trade, what role do they actually play in all of this? And so, I do want to emphasize that there are technically multiple roles within the drug trade, but they break down into three fairly straightforward roles. The first role is commonly low-level dealers and runners. So very specifically, I put juveniles older make up low-level dealers and runners. So very specifically, I want to mention, and that's why I have the bullet point right after this, technically all roles depend on age, physical ability, and level of trust. So technically, you could have an 8-year-old being a low-level dealer or a runner, or they could be a lookout or scout, or heck, they could even be involved in production or transportation of product. It all depends on their age, their physical ability, and their level of trust. It's not just one thing, it's a combination of things. So these are the three primary roles in the illegal drug trade that juveniles tend to be involved with. So the low-level dealers and runners, these are the people that you see on the street. They're the ones that are selling the product, and because we're talking juveniles, we're also talking, at school, the drug dealers. They don't necessarily make their own drugs, they're the ones that are selling it. These are those low-level dealers. The reason that they have this role, going with that level of trust, is there's a decent level of trust that, they're not just going to take the product and go. No, they're actually going to sell it. They're going to have that money, and they're going to return for all that. So there is a level of trust with that low-level dealer, as well as runners. Runners are specifically individuals who, go between the primary dealer and the low-level dealer, things like that. The ones who, if you've ever watched something like The Wire or something, and you see, the kid who goes from the one dealer who talked about the product and said, "Hold on, I gotta get it," and he sends the kid to go it. That's the runner. So the second level, which is just below the low-level dealer, is lookout or scout, and these are usually, and I want to emphasize very usually, these are for the youngest kids with the just basic level of trust. It's the kids that they don't trust with making actual payments and things like that. They're the ones that they, get a start in. And a lookout or scout, legitimately, their job is to, number one, look out for the cops. Pretty straightforward. And they're also making sure, to watch for undercover and watch for, potential clients, things like that. That's their job. That's for the low level. That's the lowest level in that. In rare occasions, and that's a high level of trust, some higher ups might involve a juvenile in production or transportation of the product. So they're not the low-level dealer. They're actually the ones that are making the product and things like that. And so I want to emphasize, I already said that every level, each position can, depend wildly on physical ability, age, and level of trust. But I also want to point out that oftentimes the front-facing juveniles are particularly chosen so that the actual person behind the production doesn't get in trouble. It's often an adult, and that way the juvenile takes the hit for it. They're get a lesser sentence and things like that, and it adds that level of separation. So I want to emphasize that this is a strategic decision. It's not just we can do it based off of our trust. No, it's also a decision from the adult behind the system. And that's actually, kind of why I lead to this. It's why I follow up with this. Risks to juvenile for involvement. And so the reality is getting involved in the drug trade and pretty much any criminal behavior is pretty straightforward. There are definitely going to be risks. And there is an increased risk of violence, injury, and arrest for juveniles in the drug trade. It's just the reality of it. It can negatively impact education and employment prospects. Anybody who's ever considered it or talked about it or, heck, thought about it might have had a conversation at one point where they heard that, people with a criminal record have a harder time getting a job. And that is a reality. That is a reality today, and it has been for quite a time. People who have a criminal record have a harder time getting jobs. So if a juvenile wants to get involved with the drug trade when they're young, that might impact their chances as they become adults to get a traditional job. And again, the impact on education, if you're involved in drugs, are you really involved in school? It's a whole complicated matter. There's the idea of strained family relationships, especially if the family is not one of the motivating factors behind getting involved in the illegal drug trade. It can lead to negative or strained family relationships. And obviously, I know it seems weird to say obviously, but substance abuse and addiction, and I'm being very intentional with what I'm saying here. Anybody who knows somebody or is connected to any type of addiction knows that addiction is really powerful and difficult. And yeah, addiction's not a funny thing. It's not an easy thing either. And yeah, getting involved in the illegal drug trade, there is a potential that a juvenile can get involved in using the drugs. And some drugs are way more addictive than others. And abusing those drugs can lead to a lifelong problem with addiction. And that's a long-term effect that we know exists. And the same with mental health problems. And I want to emphasize, when we talk about mental health problems, the things that we tend to focus on are things like depression and anxiety, but it's also PTSD. And being involved in crime can be traumatic. And so it's very important to note that there are some real heavy risks for juveniles being involved, not just, like I said, in the drug trade, but in really any crime. There is the chance of mental health problems, strained family relationships, and negative impact on education and employment prospects, as well as increased risk of violence, injury, and arrest. Literally all of these are directly related not just to drug offenses, but any criminal offenses. And I know we said the risks for the risk to the juvenile, but there's also impact on the communities. There's a risk to communities when a juvenile gets involved. And yeah, for the community itself, if a juvenile is going to be involved in it, there's a chance for an increase in crime and violence in that area. There can be a disruption of safety and cohesion, the way that the neighborhood works, operates, and feels. There can be a strain on law enforcement and social services in that area where they do not have enough resources to handle it. And there's also the perpetuation of cycles of poverty and crime. And we haven't really talked about this before, but the cycle of poverty and the cycle of crime. If you aren't familiar with this, the cycle of poverty is, it's not a definitive one for one, but it does have a strong likelihood and a strong correlation. And that's individuals who are in poverty, grow up in poverty, live in poverty, and learn in poverty. There is a likelihood, a higher likelihood, that they themselves will also grow up to be in poverty and perpetuate the cycle. Poverty is a hard thing to break out of. It's not impossible, but it's hard to break out of. And the same goes for crime. The cycle of crime is that once somebody has been exposed to crime, they are more likely to be engaged in crime again. This goes both for victims and for perpetrators. Victims can tend to be victimized more than once and can be continuously victimized, especially if they're seen as an easy target. And as far as being the victim or being the perpetrator, once you've committed a crime, the cycle of crime holds this idea that once you've done it, it becomes easier the next time. This is that continuity of crime that we talked about with juveniles. If they get involved young, they tend to be involved with it as they get older. That's the cycle of crime. All right. So we mentioned gangs briefly, and that's because, well, we said that gang influence tends to be an influence on the drug trade. And so, yeah. But let's talk about gangs for just a moment. And, yeah. We're going to start with this, and then I'm going to explain a little bit more what I want to say about gangs. So, gang involvement, much like we talked about with the drug trade, there's motivating factors for it. And lo and behold, look at that. Poverty is the first thing. It's almost like I told you, poverty is a big influence. If I asked this question on an exam or a quiz, poverty causes criminal behavior, the answer is not true. Poverty is a great influence or motivating factor on criminal rates, but poverty does not cause criminal behavior. It's just simply a big motivator for it. So we do see that poverty is the big first motivating factor for individuals getting involved with gangs. Again, much like with the drug trade, if you need to make money and you need to make money quickly, you get involved in whatever you can to make that money. And a gang offering you protection and stability, yeah, it kind of works. Another big motivator, surprisingly, for gang involvement is a lack of family support. This is something we are going to talk about here in just a second, but there is an interesting factor that we've done research on gang involvement over quite a few years of research and data. And we find that a lot of times one of the big motivators is a need for belong. Right there, search for belonging and identity. It's oftentimes related to a lack of family support. And so, yeah, gang involvement tends to be connected in a lot of times to juveniles who lack a family structure or lack a social network. They tend to need that kind of connection. So peer pressure can definitely be a motivating factor to get involved with the gang, as well as a need for protection. If they don't feel safe in their neighborhood, but they know that this gang is very active in it, yeah, being part of it means that you get that protection. Obviously, some clear consequences is violent victimization. Oftentimes, gangs can get into disputes with other gangs, which can lead to, assault with a weapon and lead to individuals dying, unfortunately, or getting severely harmed, and that's the violent victimization. Obviously, incarceration is a big thing, the limited education and employment, like we talked about already, and the perpetuating the cycle of poverty and crime. It's almost like I said that this thing happens over and over and over again. And so, yeah, like I said, one of the first reasons that we ever talk about is that search for belonging, identity, and protection. Like, this is not a surprise piece. Lack of positive role models or opportunities, family dysfunction, family gang involvement, exposure to violence and instability in environment. This is where I say nothing happens in a vacuum. Crime doesn't just happen because people want to commit crime. No, there's a motivating reason behind a crime. And there's a motivation behind people getting involved with criminal organizations like gangs. There's reason for people getting involved in the drug trade. There's people involved in etc. If you really need an example, think somewhat modernly. In the last, 10 years, we had a very popular show called Breaking Bad, which was about a man who got a cancer diagnosis, and the American medical health insurance company system that we have would not cover it, and so he went to the illegal drug trade and started forming meth and selling it. That's literally a TV show that was popular. So we know there are motivating factors. And I want to emphasize, from all the data we have on gang involvement, especially for juveniles, the big one that comes forward is a lack of cohesion in their life, in particular in relationships. They are either missing familial relationships, or they're missing peer relationships, or both. That's the big reason. And so there are some dangers I want to emphasize that are more than what we already said. We have the increased involvement in violence, crime, substance abuse, risk of victimization and injury. We already kind of implied the negative impact on education, but specifically for gang involvement, that's a little bit different and I wanted to talk about is difficulty leaving a gang. Anybody that has done any level of research into gangs know that one of the biggest issues with gang life and gang culture is you tend to not leave gang life. And if you do, it ain't easy. So that is an important aspect to consider and remember, is that these individuals, once they get involved, are likely to be involved for the rest of their life, because there is a difficulty in leaving. And then there are mental health consequences, and the big one is what I already talked about, and that's PTSD. And so, boom, what a beautiful segue to start talking about mental health issues. So I actually include this quote is directly from our textbook. Addressing the mental health needs of juvenile offenders is crucial for the rehabilitation and successful reintegration into society. In other words, in the simplest way I can say this, we, a collective group of people, based off of our knowledge that we've learned from research, we understand that in general, better mental health work is important. We understand that addressing mental health concerns is how we fix and address and deal with problems. Successful reintegration and successful rehabilitation requires us to address mental health needs. And I do want to point out, we're talking about juveniles here, but the reality is a little bit darker, because we also understand that this is how it should be for adults. And unfortunately, it's not quite seen the same way in the larger system. It's complicated. I'm not saying that we don't. Some places absolutely do focus on it. I can tell you, for one thing, here in Erie County, I do know that Erie County Corrections as a whole does believe in this mission for adults, not just juveniles. They do believe that addressing mental health issues is important for rehabilitation and successful reintegration into society. Erie County Corrections, they do believe in that. In practice, it's complicated and difficult, but I do know that from the administrative level, that is something that they do talk about. That is something that they are focused on here in Erie County. But it is complicated. So, going back to juveniles, I want to just briefly talk about some common disorders. I should emphasize this is not everything, but these are the ones that we tend to see closely connected to juveniles involved in the justice system. We have obviously substance abuse disorders. This is going back to the addiction problem. That's what this is. Addiction falls under substance abuse disorder, whether that be alcohol addiction, drug addiction, etc. That's what we're talking about there. Conduct disorders are something that I feel like we might need to define a little bit. And so conduct disorders are repetitive and persistent patterns of behavior that violate the basic rights of others or are majorly non-age appropriate behavior, societal norms, or rules. So the big two that we talk about under conduct disorders, despite mood disorders being something that people would address to one of them, is aggression. Aggression issues like anger management fall under conduct disorders because oftentimes aggression and anger management leads to particular behaviors that result in lashing out, that violate another person's personal space and rights. That's why it would be a conduct disorder. Another thing is general antisocial behaviors. And I want to say this because I've had students in the past go, well, what exactly does that mean? When I say antisocial behaviors, I don't just mean that you don't want to hang out with people and you kind of want to be left alone and in your room. That's normal teenager antisocial behavior. When we say conduct disorder, antisocial behavior, I mean, planning out attacks on people, I hate to say it, but the traditional school shooter kind of cliches where, they are isolated, they tend to be by themselves, they focus and ideate on death and things like that. Those are antisocial behaviors that are potential triggers or potential warning signs of a more serious issue. Mood disorders are anxiety, depression, things like that. I don't really need to explain that too much, but I wanted to put that out there. Trauma-related disorders, the big one that we talk about is PTSD, because the reality is PTSD can actually seriously impact the way a person thinks and the way a person acts. They can have, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but they can have a warped sense of reality where they view everyone as a potential threat and a problem rather than there being safe spaces and safe people, and that can lead to certain behaviors that would be considered problematic and potentially be criminal. And so that's why we identify that PTSD and trauma-related disorders can have a real impact on how a juvenile might engage with the world around them. So with PTSD in particular, we look at things like avoidance behaviors, hyperarousal, and the issue of flashbacks. And then only because I think it's really kind of funny to talk about is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And not that ADHD is funny, but it's funny to consider ADHD as a common disorder of mental health that would impact juvenile delinquency. But when you think about how ADHD actually can manifest in people, you start to understand how it does relate. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is actually fairly common in individuals, especially youth. We've had more and more studies on it and more information on it. But in some cases, there are, what some old school definitions would call problematic behavior, like inability to sit still, pay attention, things like that, that in school would be punished, when in reality, oftentimes, if we actually think about it, it was likely to be undiagnosed and untreated ADHD. So it is important to note that ADHD is something that is one of those common disorders that we are now identifying as not a problem, but something that we need to be aware of when looking at juvenile delinquency. Because if it is undiagnosed or untreated ADHD that has led to the behaviors, simply addressing that could reduce or eliminate the problematic behavior, if that makes sense. Hopefully that's pretty clear. Okay. There's also another thing that I didn't write on here, but is important to mention, and that's co-occurring issues. And if you're thinking, what the heck is a co-occurring issue? It's the concept that more than one of these things can be active at a time. Most people who have experienced some level of trauma in their life will tell you that often it's not just PTSD that you end up walking away with. You tend to have a lot more. Not that you need to know this. Not that I'm not going to dive into the super personal story that I have, but I do have some PTSD from some negative relationships and engagements when I was younger. That has led to me having anxiety and depression. So yeah, I have anxiety, I have depression, and I have PTSD. My PTSD is mostly managed. My depression and anxiety is mostly managed by regular psychiatric. I see a therapist, and I take antidepressants for it that manage it for the most part. So these are common disorders. These aren't something that, only 3 people ever feel. No, this is fairly common, and I feel as a teacher and somebody who experiences these things, this is the right way to say, if you experience one of these things, it's okay. You're allowed to experience those things, and there is help available and things like that. And especially, I know I'm teaching adults because this is a college class, but understanding that juveniles also face these things. If you are a parent and you have a child that seems to be acting out and you haven't considered, trying to find out if they have undiagnosed ADHD or they experience some type of trauma that they're processing or they're not processing and they are not talking with you about it, it's kind of the kind of thing to be like aware it's possible. Have that conversation. So I do want to point out, in our system as it is today, and has been for quite a while, there are challenges in identifying the needs of juveniles, especially related to mental health issues. And so the very first thing, and I can't believe I have to say it, but we have limited resources for screening and assessment. Across the board, in most jurisdictions, there is a lack of budget and a lack of resources, which includes personnel and things like that, that help screen and assess mental health issues for juveniles. And you can even pull this out a little bit, and this applies to the adult system as well. We know that a lot of people tend to not be screened or properly assessed for mental health disorders. We've gotten better. There are some that absolutely have gone through the system and it's helped, and there's others that just haven't met it yet. And I want to mention that the second big challenge in identifying mental health disorders is something, again, that's not just exclusive to juveniles but to adults as well, and that's the stigma associated to mental illness. That's why I said, as a teacher, I feel that I have the appropriate platform when we talk about this to mention my own struggles. Not that you need to know every part about it, and I'm never going to tell you all that stuff. But I want to take away that stigma that mental illness is a problem and it's only for failed people, and I couldn't possibly have it. I'm a successful worker. I go to work every day and I'm doing this. It can happen to anyone. Taking away the stigma associated with mental illness that you're incomplete or you're failed or you're broken or that you couldn't those are all wrong, and those are something that we want to walk away from. We want to take that stigma away. And because it's so prevalent in our culture, it also applies to our kids. A lot of time kids will try to hide depression, partly because teens going through puberty are extra emotional, and so sometimes it's hard to identify the difference between an emotional sadness from puberty and depression. And so sometimes that stigma prevents teens from talking about it and getting to help. The reality is we need to just be better at this. And I wish there was an easy answer for it. And there kind of is, but it's not in one size fits all, and that's to be more open and talk about it. So there it is. That's what I have to say about that. Because of the stigma associated with mental illness, though, we have the problem of masking or minimizing symptoms. Masking means literally to hide them. Minimizing means making them seem less severe. We do this because of that stigma, and so this is a compounding issue. This is not just we fix one thing, we've solved it. No, it's multiple parts. So yeah, we have those are three big issues that are all tightly connected together. And then we have our fourth challenge in identifying needs, and that's the overlapping symptoms of mental health issues and delinquent behavior. And I teased it a little bit when I said ADHD, because this is the reality. There are several symptoms of certain mental health disorders that are very similar to the warning signs of delinquent behavior. So we identify those things, and sometimes we misidentify because we're focused on one part and not the other. So there is difficulty in this system. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying, we can just figure it out, but we only know if we try. Yeah, we're going to talk about that here in just a second. So I do want to mention that two things that have come out from this challenge in identifying needs and the overall issue of mental health disorders in juvenile justice is we have started developing crisis intervention programs. So rather than focusing on sending necessarily an officer to a issue of severe mental health, we would send a crisis individual, somebody who's trained in mental health and de-escalation, to try and work somebody down. And the other big one that we've seen, and this is not an exclusive to juvenile justice, but we've seen it in a lot of different fields, is trauma-informed care. I'll even say in education at the college level, here at EC3, we've actually made a point for several of our faculty, full-time and adjunct when available, we've had trainings on trauma-informed teaching, understanding that people experience different things and might be in different stages of recovery and of processing particular things. And so it's not tiptoeing, it's not ignoring, it's identifying where people are and trying to be as appropriate as possible for that. And so this is where I say yes. Very specifically, anybody who is listening to this in the background or is watching this actively, I applaud you for doing that. But I do want to mention the next slide, maybe two, I think it's two total, is about juvenile sex offenders. So we are going to be talking about sexual assault, and that is going to be, I'm going to try to make it as brief as possible, but still informative. I want to mention on the exams, I think there's only one or two questions total on this. And I do that in particular because this is a serious subject that it's important for us to talk about in criminal justice because it's something that happens. But I also know that this is a, unfortunately, very common crime. And if you or someone you know has been a victim of sexual assault, I do want to mention, there are services available that are to no cost to you. If it was fairly recent, there's the Crime Victim Center here in Erie that does wonderful work. They work with not only the victims, but with the family of the victims, people who are close to the victim of any type of sexual assault, or really, they also do work with any victim of crime. So if you are somebody who's had that, please reach out to the Crime Victim Center. They can provide you with services, with counseling. They can put you in touch. They can help with victim advocacy. They can do a lot of that work. And I cannot emphasize them enough. That little background thing about me and having some PTSD, they have been involved in my own life personally, so I don't just recommend them as somebody who has worked with them. I recommend them as somebody who's used their services. So we are going to be talking about sexual assault. So if you are not in the appropriate headspace to be engaged in a conversation about that, please, I would say, scrub through the video by holding the progress bar and going to where you see, I would say, go to the PowerPoint slide on Blackboard and find where we no longer are talking about juvenile sexual offenders, and I would scrub the video till that point, okay? If I can, I'll put a jump feature, skip feature in this video. I'm not sure how to do that. I'm going to see if I can figure that out. But I do want you to be aware that that's what we're going to be talking about for just a few minutes. So, this is your warning to pass through the next section a little bit quickly. And here we go. Okay. So, if you are still here, let's talk about juvenile sex offenders. So, when we talk about sexual assault and sex offenses involving juveniles, the big thing that gets focused on is child victims by adult perpetrators. And I do want to emphasize really briefly, not that that's not a common thing. That is a real component of this. But there's more complications to this. This is very sensitive and very complex. So I do want to point out, before we dive into some of this other information, juvenile sexual assault or sexual assault of a minor, anyone under the legal age of 18, we have lots of different research studies and data on it. And what we have found is that actually the old stranger danger thing is not fully accurate. The majority of sexual assaults on minors is conducted by somebody who has a close personal relationship to the juvenile victim. It can be family members, it can be teachers, it can be coaches, it can be community members, it can be neighbors. And surprisingly, and I say this because it's a surprise to me, but it makes sense, a large portion of the offenders who offend juveniles are themselves other juveniles. That's why I said it's very complicated. It's really weird to talk about, but a large chunk of offenders to juvenile victims of sexual assault are their peers. They're people around their age. It is not easy to talk about. I want to emphasize one of the things that has been talked about to... How do I want to say this? One way that we understand that one of the reasons why juvenile sexual offenders, the people who are committing the crime, there's typically falls into one of two reasons why a juvenile ends up sexually offending one of their peers. The first reason is they themselves have been a victim of the same crime, and so they're perpetrating it on somebody else, which, whether that's because they are trying to get control of the situation and get power themselves that they lost, or they don't understand that it's wrong and they're perpetuating it because that's what they understand is normal. Okay? Those are the typical two reasons why a juvenile sex offender responds the way they do. I do want to mention one of the things that's been suggested by different experts on different studies is, and it's one of the more commonly held beliefs, is that one fairly positive way of dealing with this problem is age-appropriate, proper sexual education. Here in this country, in the United States of America, we have for the most part, general abstinence-only sexual education belief in a lot of places. And the science tells us that that is not helpful. It doesn't reduce the number of pregnancies, it doesn't reduce the number of STDs, and it doesn't reduce sexual involvement. In fact, it does the exact opposite. And so one of the things that's been constantly talked about is having age-appropriate and consistent sexual education. Some people say to start young, and I don't mean let's teach kindergartners what sex is. No, we teach concepts like consent, and we start easy with, if you've ever seen those online videos of from like the kindergarten teacher, do you want a hug, a high five, a fist bump, nothing at all? And the kids come in and they choose what they want, and so they can get a hug from the teacher, or they can get a high five or a fist bump, or they can just wave at them. That's teaching consent at a young age. And so that's really what one of the things that's been put forward by most experts is we need to teach proper sexual education. We need to teach what appropriate sex looks like, what is problematic. We need to teach, because one of the bigger problems is a lot of kids, once they get older, they look up sexual information on the internet and then they find pornography. And not that pornography is inherently bad, but pornography is not what real sex looks like. It involves different things. Sometimes it can involve kinks and things like that. We get into the realm of bondage, dominance, and sadomasochism, BDSM. We can get into things like autoerotic asphyxiation, which has to do with choking oneself. Like, they can get into these niche categories of sex and believe that's what's normal, and that can lead to inappropriate sexual behaviors. So this is why I said age-appropriate, comprehensive sex education. It's complicated, but it's something that we need to work towards. And that's why I said most experts in this field that have done the research say that's one of the biggest things we need to identify. And we struggle with that. Some schools do better at, actually implementing a realistic sexual education experience, but we still have huge gaps that we need to identify. So, going back to, this is complex and highly sensitive. And I want to emphasize, specifically for juvenile sex offenders, the emphasis is not just on punishment, but on therapeutic and educational strategies. We understand, for the most part, that juveniles, the kids are kids. They make mistakes, and we don't want to punish them unnecessarily. So for juvenile sex offenders, we try to be more therapeutic and on release than we are with adult sex offenders, which is a complicated matter, and that's not our purpose in this class or in this lecture to discuss it, but I wanted to mention at least here. I do want to mention there are some problems in our country still. Juvenile sex offenders are put on the sex offender registry, and depending on the level that they are classified as, they could be on it for the rest of their lives, even if it was something that realistically was not serious enough to require it. It's a complicated matter. We're not going to dive into it, but I wanted to mention this. So, how do we identify a juvenile sex offender other than the fact that, they committed a crime? Well, we have the J-SOAP-2 test, which we have the SOAP-2 test that we do with the adults. So the J is just adding juvenile, but it's the Sexual Offender Assessment Protocol. And what they do is they evaluate the risk factors that one poses, that one actually has, that has led them towards this particular behavior. And what they do is they use a type of scale system to assess certain components. And the whole point of the J-SOAP-2 test and the SOAP-2 test is to identify the likelihood of rehabilitation. So obviously, if the sex offender who's going through this process shows that they're likely to never recover from this, the chances of rehabilitation are low, and so there'll be difference in how punishment is served and things like that. So what they do is they assess things like sexual drive and preoccupations, impulse behavior and antisocial behavior. They look at intervention compliance, and they also look at community support. The pretty basic things that they're trying to identify. And so this covers what I want to say about juvenile sex offenders directly. So, did I not? Oh, I didn't. Huh. I apologize. I missed a component that I wanted to write. I thought I had a slide on this. So apologies, everyone. So if you recall, previously we talked about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. And believe it or not, specifically for juvenile sex offenders and for sex offenders in general, CBT is the cornerstone for their treatment. Because if you remember, cognitive behavioral therapy is trying to figure out how the brain works, how it influences our behavior, and that leads to the problematic behavior. So CBT is the cornerstone for treatment for these types of individuals. Group therapy is often used where they confront their behaviors, receive peer feedback, and learn from others' experience. Treatment also obviously includes, and I said educational strategies, so education on sexual health and appropriate sexual behaviors to correct any misconceptions and reinforce norms that discourage sexual violence. All right, now we're moving on. Child welfare. So, pretty straightforward. Child welfare is a system that is separate from juvenile justice, but works closely with juvenile justice. So, obviously, juvenile justice deals with juveniles who have committed a crime. Child welfare is the system that deals with when children are victims, usually of abuse and neglect, and so the state gets involved. And because they're deeply connected, we have some crossover, and we're going to talk about that. But so child welfare gets involved typically with adverse childhood experience, things like abuse, neglect, and serious dysfunction. The welfare to justice juvenile justice pipeline is real because if CPS or child welfare gets involved, which CPS is Child Protective Services, that's another name for the child welfare system, depending on your state and things like that. But if CPS or child welfare gets involved, a lot of times this puts the child in foster care. And I want to mention this very straightforward and very honestly. Foster care is not inherently bad. Foster care was designed with the goal of reunification. The goal of the foster care system is to temporarily take care of the child for the parent or guardian to correct their issues and mistakes so that they can be reunited with their kid. That is the purpose of foster care. Now, it doesn't always work that way. I want to mention there are serious issues of child welfare and CPS. That's not what we're trying to get into. What I want to talk about is specifically the welfare to juvenile justice pipeline. Once a juvenile is put in the system, they are forever marred by that. If a child is put into foster care because of a neglectful parent, it's not always, but they now have a higher risk of being involved in the juvenile justice system. We know from several studies that the welfare system itself can be traumatic, can cause serious mental health disorders and issues in juveniles, and oftentimes leads to acting out, frustration, aggression, and other behaviors that are often problem behaviors, much like I say right down here. Frequent placement disruptions, especially if one foster home doesn't work, creates instability and diminishes security, which increases fear and problem behaviors. This is why we say the welfare to juvenile justice pipeline, it's a real thing. Once it gets involved, it can lead to a child getting seriously involved in the juvenile justice system, not as a victim, but as a perpetrator. And abuse and neglect are traumatic, and they can lead to problematic behaviors. Remember, I said PTSD can create problematic behaviors. It can lead to individuals acting out in ways that are not appropriate. This is the reality. Child welfare is meant to help save and protect these kids from abuse. And a lot of times when they get involved, it leads to them becoming perpetrators. It's a weird, complicated web. Much like I said previously, this is complicated. So, what we say here is it's system-induced criminalization. So I want to say some behaviors that are typical of a trauma response are running away, substance abuse, and truancy. If you've been paying attention in this class, overall, these are all criminal behaviors. we consider these status offenses for juveniles. So they're punished. Instead of addressing the underlying cause, which is trauma from being part of the welfare system, instead we just treat them as if they're problematic children. Do we see why this is a complicated matter, and why I said this is really frustrating, and why I said, it's complicated? I believe I mentioned it in the very first lecture video, and I'm bringing it up here again. There are two rules, or two sayings that I have about, that I say in every criminal justice class, except for what is it called? The capstone and internship. I say the two rules about criminal justice are, number one, it's complicated, and number two, it's all theoretical. This is the problem. Hopefully, having this discussion and seeing these different types of problems, you can see why I say it's problematic. Each one played into the next one. And right here, we're even talking about kids who are victims of issues with their parents can also then become quote-unquote criminals in their own system. But they were victims, and that's the problem. And so, yes, we have this issue. And I want to give us, not that I can end on a happy term at this point, but crossover youth. These are a colloquial term that we use to explain children who are both in the welfare system and who are also in the juvenile justice system. Those kids who have been taken away for their safety, but has also led to them acting out and getting involved in the juvenile justice system. We call them the crossover youth because they cross over those two components. Please note, it seems depressing and hopeless because there's a lot of sadness with this. But the reality is things can change. We can change over time. I don't have a positive thing for you because this is the end of the PowerPoint, but I want to tell you all how we change this is by educating. The more people understand and know truths about this, the better we can be about changing it. So if you are somebody who's interested in going into juvenile justice, I hope you take today's lecture especially to heart. I know all the lectures are important, but I hope you take this one in particular because this is one of those that should be a motivating factor for you to get involved and want to change it. Because that's how it's going to change, is people like you. I'm a teacher. I do my best to educate, and I do my best to provide a safe space for people that never had that opportunity. That's what I do. I'm not going to get a career in those fields because I don't have that ability personally. It's a personal choice. I can't do it. But if you're somebody who wants to go into this and can do this, I'm hoping that you make those changes. You work to change it for the better. That's my happy ending, is that you have the power to change it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I know this was a little bit harder of a subject to talk about today because we talked about a lot of different things, but yeah, thank you very much, and I will see you all in the next video.